So let's take a breath before we step into what's happening inside Russia tonight, because what's unfolding behind those heavy Kremlin walls isn't just another political tremor or another round of sanctions. It's something deeper, something structural, something that feels less like a crisis and more like a reckoning. For 2 decades, Vladimir Putin built a system that looked to the outside world like a nation reborn, modern, confident, flush with oil money, moving in step with global markets. But beneath the steel, the glass, the parades, the projections of strength, there was always a different reality. Not a country in the traditional sense, but an ecosystem of power held together by fear, wealth, and silence. A carefully controlled organism that only functioned as long as every part obeyed the rules. And now, piece by piece, that organism is malfunctioning. Because for the first time since Putin walked into the presidency in 1999, when Russia was exhausted, chaotic, even humiliated, the machine he built is beginning to grind against itself. It's not a collapse in the dramatic, cinematic sense. It's not a revolution on the streets. It's quieter, more internal, more dangerous. It's the slow, persistent sound of an elite that no longer believes the center can protect them. And when that belief dies, everything built upon it begins to shake. Look at the oligarchs, the men who once enjoyed the full warmth of Kremlin favor. The men who toasted Putin's stability in French restaurants in London, who parked their yachts in Barcelona, who bought football clubs, mansions, private jets, European residency, all under the unspoken understanding that as long as they stayed loyal, they would stay rich. That was the pact. You don't challenge the political system. You don't question decisions. You don't fund the wrong causes. In exchange, you receive access to the kind of wealth only a petrostate can generate. Wealth beyond imagination, wealth beyond law, wealth that flowed through the arteries of the Kremlin itself. But that arrangement is breaking. You can see it in sanction lists, in court filings, in the sudden reappearance of obscure holding companies in Cyprus and Kazakhstan. You can see it in the way oligarchs sell assets, not because they want to, but because they have to. Because the jets they once used to hop from Zurich to Monaco are grounded under EU orders. Because the villas they bragged about on private islands are now frozen under international investigations. Because the bank accounts they believed were untouchable have been locked behind compliance reviews and legal barriers. According to European and British records, over 1,800 Russian individuals and entities are under financial restrictions, a number unprecedented in modern history for a G20 country. Among them, almost every billionaire who mattered to the Kremlin. And here's the irony. For years, Putin mocked the West as weak and decadent. He laughed as oligarchs flashed their wealth abroad. He said, let them eat their yachts. But the thing about men who rise through privilege is that they don't forget what comfort feels like. And they don't tolerate losing it. When sanctions hit, when yachts were seized, when real estate portfolios started disappearing under asset forfeiture laws, the loyalty that once felt permanent suddenly began to look optional. Because Putin's system, for all its theatrics, wasn't built on ideology. It wasn't built on nationalism. It wasn't even built on charisma. It was built on an economic formula. Loyalty in exchange for protection. Fear in exchange for stability. Silence in exchange for privilege. And once the protection becomes unreliable, once the fear stops delivering security, the equation changes, the power pyramid wobbles. And Russia's numbers tonight tell a story the Kremlin doesn't want to discuss. Over $300 billion in foreign reserves, effectively frozen. The ruble swinging wildly despite capital controls, dropping from 70 to over 100 per dollar. Inflation rising into double digits. 1 million Russians, engineers, doctors, programmers, business owners leaving the country in what may be the largest brain drain since the collapse of the USSR. Russia calls this economic adaptation. But adaptation implies strategy, planning, resilience. What's happening instead looks more like triage, a state scrambling to patch holes faster than new ones appear. Because the deeper truth is this: Putin's Russia was rich, but never strong, wealthy, but never stable, impressive from a distance, but hollow from within. The skyscrapers of Moscow, the shopping centers, the luxury cars, they were built not on innovation or competitiveness, but on oil prices and resource extraction. The economy was a funnel, not an engine. A system designed to redistribute natural wealth upward into loyal hands, not outward into national capacity. For years, that model worked because oil was plentiful, pipelines were profitable, and the West was willing to trade principles for cheap gas. But once those conditions changed, once isolation replaced integration, the facade began to fade. And this is the moment we now find ourselves in. An era where the old pillars of power are eroding, where oligarchs whisper about exit strategies in Dubai restaurants, where regional governors grumble about budgets they can't stretch, where soldiers complain about missing payments, where the most loyal institutions, the Orthodox Church, state television, the security agencies begin choosing their words carefully, offering support for stability instead of for the president himself. In a system built on fear, distance is the first sign of fracture. But let's rewind, because none of this makes sense without understanding the architecture of Putin's rule. When he came to power, Russia was tired. The 1,990 seconds were chaotic. Inflation destroyed. Savings, crime soared, factories collapsed. People wanted one thing, order. And Putin offered it, not through ideology, not through democratic reform, but through consolidation of power. He told the oligarchs, stay out of politics and keep your billions. Support me and I protect you. Challenge me and I erase you. The arrest of Khodorkovsky in 2003 was the warning shot heard across every boardroom in Russia. It said, wealth in Russia is rented, not owned, and the landlord lives in the Kremlin. For years, the system hummed. Oil prices surged, GDP rose, Western companies invested, Moscow glittered, Russians grew wealthier, traveled more, consumed more. But underneath the prosperity was a fatal weakness, an economy dependent on a single man's network of loyalty, a modern state built on medieval foundations. And that is the danger tonight, not the sanctions, not the battlefield losses, not even the protests. The danger is the system's architecture itself, a structure that cannot withstand sustained pressure, external or internal, because it was never meant to. It was meant to function during good weather, not storms. And now the storm is here. So let's continue, because the part we're entering now is the one where the cracks in Putin's system stop being subtle and start becoming structural. This is the point where the breakage becomes visible, not just to analysts or insiders, but to the very people who helped build the machine. And the irony is almost poetic. The system that thrived on silence is now being unraveled by the quietest sound in politics hesitation. You can trace the first real fracture not in the speeches or the propaganda or even the battlefield reports, but in the spreadsheets. Because every authoritarian state eventually discovers the same inconvenient truth. Power can intimidate people, but it can't intimidate numbers. And sometime around mid-2022, the math stopped obeying the Kremlin. Factories that were supposed to be producing consumer goods suddenly had to repurpose their assembly lines for military needs. Western components vanished. Supply chains broke. Domestic manufacturers found themselves facing an impossible task: replace global systems overnight. The Kremlin called this import substitution, a phrase meant to evoke industrial renewal, patriotic self-reliance. But anyone who spent time inside the Russian economy knew it was more like improvisation under duress, a scramble, not a strategy. Take aviation, one of the clearest windows into the state's decline. Before the war, Russia depended heavily on Western-made components to keep its commercial airlines safe and functional. Boeing, Airbus, Rolls-Royce engines. Thousands of parts that need regular replacement. After sanctions, those parts became illegal to import. So airlines did what people trapped in a burning building do. They cannibalized the furniture to stay alive a little longer. Perfectly functioning planes were grounded, stripped for spare parts to keep others flying. By 2024, Russian airlines were essentially operating a Frankenstein fleet patched together, increasingly unreliable and fully dependent on the black market. That alone is enough to tell you a country is not in a state of adaptation. But aviation was only one piece of the puzzle. Other sectors were collapsing in quieter, more fragmented ways. Pharmaceutical shortages, medical equipment shortages, universities losing access to research software, high-tech industries effectively frozen. Russian tech firms, once proud of their global competitiveness, now struggling because the tools they relied on, cloud servers, processors, encrypted communication platforms, were suddenly unavailable. And through all this, the Kremlin's message was the same: everything is under control. But control, like fear, has an expiration date, because you can control the media. You can control the parliament. You can control the courts. But you cannot control the world economy. And you cannot print innovation. Yet the Kremlin tried. It printed money. It forced exporters to convert foreign earnings into state-controlled accounts. It blocked citizens from buying foreign currency. It told banks to hold down interest rates even as inflation climbed. In effect, it created a financial ecosystem where the ruble wasn't just a currency, it was a cage. And anyone with significant assets was suddenly desperate to escape. That desperation is how you get the capital flight numbers we now see. Over $250 billion quietly leaving Russia through honorary consulates, shell companies, crypto channels, luxury imports disguised as industrial equipment. Money always finds the exit, and in Russia, it sprinted through it. And that brings us back to the oligarchs, the architects, the beneficiaries, the courtiers of the system. Because while the propaganda insists Russia is united, the elite behavior tells a different story. They're not simply leaving, they're evacuating. Dubai is the new Moscow suburb. Yerevan is the new Rubliovka. Restaurants in Cyprus, Montenegro, and Istanbul now have Russian-only menus. Property registries in Europe and the Middle East show a surge of purchases through holding companies and family trusts, wealth being laundered out of Russia before the door locks shut. And yet, even in exile, they maintain the silence. They don't say Putin. They don't criticize the war. They don't call it a mistake. Not because they believe, but because after 20 years of conditioning, the fear still works even thousands of miles away. It's psychological, woven into their identities. They owe everything they have to him, and now, as the system turns inward, they realize the bill is due. But the deeper shift isn't happening among oligarchs. It's happening among the mid-tier elites, the deputy ministers, regional governors, security officials, heads of state corporations. These are the people who actually run Russia day to day. And for the first time in 2 decades, they're allowing themselves to imagine a future without him. Not because they want democracy, not because they care about reform, but because the risk of staying loyal is quietly becoming larger than the risk of stepping aside. This is the transformation that kills authoritarian systems. Not rebellion, but a silent, spreading instinct for self-preservation. And you can hear it in the language. High-ranking officials no longer use his name as often. Public statements focus on the state, national security, the future of Russia, not the president. It's subtle, but in a system where power relies on ritual language, these small deviations are tectonic shifts. Meanwhile, ordinary Russians, the teachers, the nurses, the factory workers, are living with consequences that propaganda cannot conceal. Grocery prices doubling, medication shortages, housing costs rising, salaries stagnating. Many families now spend nearly half their income on basic necessities. These aren't ideological problems. These are survival problems. And survival problems turn even the most obedient citizens into quiet skeptics. Which brings us to the most important dynamic of all fear. Fear was the glue. Fear of losing your job. Fear of arrest. Fear of speaking too loudly. Fear of being noticed. But here's the thing about fear. Once it stops protecting the state, it starts consuming it. Everyone becomes suspicious of everyone else. Everyone begins imagining escape routes. Everyone becomes a potential defector. And in that environment, power doesn't project confidence, it projects decay. The Kremlin's response was predictable. More censorship, harsher laws, bigger fines, longer prison sentences. Words like peace and war became illegal depending on who said them. Critical bloggers arrested, journalists exiled, teachers fired for social media posts. But repression today doesn't work the way it did in the Soviet era. The internet can't be sealed. VPN usage in Russia has tripled. Telegram channels run by exiles have millions of Russian subscribers. Propaganda can't keep up with reality, and reality is hitting people in their wallets, in their kitchens, in their hospitals. So yes, the system is still standing. The TV anchors still smile. The parades still march. The portraits still hang on the walls. But the fear that once held everything together has begun to turn inward into a paranoia that weakens the state from within. So let's pick up from here, because the moment we're entering now is the point where the decay inside the system stops being theoretical and becomes measurable, visible in alliances, in trade routes, in diplomatic silences that speak louder than condemnation. Because while Putin has always projected the image of a leader who commands global respect through fear or admiration, what's happening tonight is the slow collapse of that illusion abroad. And like all collapsing illusions, it starts not with enemies, but with allies. For years, Russia positioned itself as a geopolitical counterweight to the West, not by building strong alliances, but by cultivating a sense of strategic indispensability. You can't ignore us, the message went. You can't isolate us. We are too big, too resource-rich, too unpredictable. And for a long time, the world acted accordingly. Europe bought Russia's gas. China bought its weapons. The Middle East bought its mercenaries. African nations bought its grain and its political support. Even countries that distrusted Putin still needed him for something. That's why the Kremlin could punch above its weight, because it understood how to exploit the dependencies of others. But those dependencies are dissolving. Quietly, steadily, and in ways that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. Look at China, Russia's supposed no-limits partner. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Beijing offered rhetorical sympathy but little else. No weapons, no sanctions relief, no formal alliance. Chinese banks began restricting transactions with Russian institutions to avoid secondary sanctions. Chinese exporters grew cautious. And Chinese diplomats, always careful, always calculating, began talking about regional stability instead of strategic partnership. China wants cheap oil, not a collapsing client. It wants a stable neighbor, not a black hole of sanctions. It wants influence, not entanglement. And the moment Moscow became a liability, Beijing stepped sideways, not dramatically, not insultingly, but unmistakably. Because superpowers don't shout when they lose respect for a partner. They simply stop speaking. India, too, made its choice. While buying Russian crude at discounted prices, it demanded payment terms Russia could barely meet. Indian refiners delayed transfers. Indian banks hesitated on ruble transactions. And behind closed doors, diplomats began asking uncomfortable questions. What happens if Russia splits? If its energy markets crash? If its borders destabilize? India doesn't say it publicly, but it's adjusting to a future where Moscow is no longer a central pillar of its foreign policy. And then there's Europe, the continent Putin believed was too dependent to ever push back. For 20 years, he used gas pipelines like geopolitical levers, a threat here, a discount there, a warning in winter. But when Europe finally cut its dependency in 2022 and 2023 almost completely, the shock inside the Kremlin was existential. They never believed it would happen. They didn't think Europe had the political will. But Europe adapted in record time, securing LNG from the US, Norway, and Qatar, ramping up renewables, building new infrastructure in months instead of years. And when the winter came, the lights stayed on. That was the moment Putin lost the myth of indispensability. Because once Europe proved it could survive without Russian energy, Russia lost its biggest bargaining chip, its entire leverage over the West. And without that leverage, Russia's global influence narrowed to weapons deals, mercenaries, and diplomatic theatrics. And while all this happened, NATO, an institution Putin called obsolete, did the one thing he spent 2 decades trying to prevent. It expanded. Finland and Sweden joined, instantly doubling NATO's border with Russia and erasing a century of neutrality. Countries that once hesitated to anger Moscow now openly host NATO exercises. Even nations on the fence, Serbia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, began recalibrating their ties. The Kremlin's feared sphere of influence didn't just shrink, it inverted. And the more isolated Russia became, the more its neighbors questioned the longevity of the empire. Because that's the quiet truth of geopolitics. Power is not about how loud you shout. It's about how many people still pick up the phone when you call. And tonight, fewer are picking up. But let's pause here, because the global shift is only part of the story. The other part, the darker part, is what isolation does to a country that already relies heavily on control. When a regime loses global support, it doesn't reform. It contracts, it tightens, it improvises. And in that improvisation, it begins cannibalizing itself. You see this in the shadow economy that has formed around Russia's isolation. Tankers with turned-off transponders shipping sanctioned oil under fake flags. Middlemen in Dubai laundering luxury imports disguised as industrial machinery. Russian companies registering in Astana and Tbilisi to hide beneficial ownership. Billions in arms, oil, and gold flowing through opaque networks built not for strategy, but for survival. This is not the behavior of a stable state. This is the behavior of a system that knows it cannot function in daylight. And the consequences are showing. The Kremlin's old formula, use money to buy loyalty, is breaking because the money is running out. Subsidies, once spread across regions, are shrinking. Infrastructure budgets are slashed. Pensions lag behind inflation. State corporations are quietly selling assets to meet payroll. Even the military, once the sacred cow of the regime, is rationing equipment, ammunition, uniforms. Soldiers complain about late payments. Families complain about compensation. and officials whisper about budgets that simply don't add up. That's why the war didn't just strain the system, it exposed its limits. The Kremlin thought it could fight a 20th century war with a 21st century economy dependent on global integration. But when that integration collapsed, so did the illusion of strength. Yet the most consequential shift, the one that truly threatens the regime, is not economic or geopolitical. It is psychological. It is the slow erosion of belief. Every authoritarian state depends on a collective myth. The myth that the leader is strong, that the system is stable, that the alternative is chaos. For 20 years, that myth held Russia together. But myths are fragile. They survive only as long as people don't see behind the curtain. And tonight, the curtain is slipping. People see that the economy is poorer, that their sons are being drafted, that their medications are missing, that their savings are evaporating, that the government no longer seems invincible, but desperate. Propaganda still blares, but fewer are listening. Fear still exists, but fewer are frozen by it. Silence still dominates, but it sounds different now, less obedient, more exhausted, and that exhaustion is the real threat. Because authoritarian regimes don't fall when people rise. They fall when people stop pretending. So let's keep going, because now we're entering the part of the story where Russia's internal fractures start interacting with its historical memory, the place where present tension collides with centuries of repetition. And if you know Russian history, you know that the country doesn't just move in cycles, it gets trapped in them. The faces change, the slogans change, the borders change. But the pattern, the rise of centralized power, the illusion of stability, the sudden unraveling that part never goes away. It's like Russia is forever haunted by the ghost of its own past. And you can see that ghost walking through Moscow tonight. Because the moment fear breaks, really breaks, the system begins to behave exactly like its predecessors did. Quietly, paranoid, heavy-footed. Every ministry becomes a bunker. Every bureaucrat becomes a potential traitor. Every silence becomes suspicious. And that's when the machinery of the state stops functioning as a government and starts functioning as a survival apparatus. This is the stage Russia is entering now, the stage where institutions stop solving problems and start hiding them, where the truth becomes too dangerous to acknowledge, so everyone lies upwards, where problems don't get addressed because acknowledging them might suggest the leadership made a mistake, and where the leadership, in turn, becomes trapped in a cocoon of flattery, distortions, and half-truths. This is the point at which authoritarian systems go blind. The same process happened in the late Soviet era. Reports were falsified, numbers were padded, failures were reframed as successes, factories reported production increases even as output fell. Officials pretended everything was under control while the foundation quietly crumbled. The regime collapsed not because foreign powers defeated it, but because it suffocated under the weight of its own illusions. A system that refuses to acknowledge reality eventually becomes unable to operate within it, and the same echoes emerge now. You can see it in the way economic data has been restricted or classified, how inflation statistics have been massaged, how casualty numbers from the war have vanished from public reporting, how regions compete to fabricate optimistic narratives to curry favor with Moscow, how officials pretend shortages don't exist even as pharmacies empty out. A country that sanitizes its own truth eventually loses the ability to govern itself. But here's the part that makes this moment distinct from past collapses. Russia is not just lying to itself, it is lying to a world that has access to real-time information. There is no Iron Curtain today, no sealed-off media, no isolation from global communication. Russians can use VPNs, they can read foreign news, they can see satellite images. They can scroll through Telegram channels run by exiled journalists. They can watch video messages from soldiers complaining about broken equipment and unpaid salaries. The truth leaks through every crack. And when a population sees two realities, the one on TV and the one in their refrigerator, the illusion cannot hold. But let's pause here. Because it's not just ordinary Russians who are noticing the cracks. It's the people who enforce the system, the police, the military, the intelligence services. These are the institutions that uphold Putin's rule, the very backbone of the fear apparatus. And even they are beginning to shift. Not openly, not loudly, but perceptibly. Police officers privately complain about overtime and low pay. National Guard units whisper about equipment shortages. FSB officers grow frustrated with bureaucratic chaos. Regional military commissars quietly cut deals to avoid conscripting influential families. None of this is rebellion. None of it is organized. But all of it signals the same thing. The belief that the system is unshakable is fading because the people tasked with upholding fear must believe in its effectiveness. Once they sense that fear is failing, once they start acting out of self-preservation instead of obedience, the state loses its last pillar. That's why authoritarian regimes often appear strongest right before they weaken most dramatically. They double down on repression, they expand censorship, they pass harsher laws, they make bigger threats. They stage more dramatic public displays of loyalty. It looks like strength, but it's actually panic. A state that still feels confident doesn't need to shout. A state that fears collapse shouts constantly. You can see this panic in Putin's decision-making. Increasingly isolated, increasingly dependent on a narrow circle of loyalists, increasingly distrustful of dissent, and increasingly convinced that conspiracy, not policy failure, is the source of his problems. This is classic late-stage authoritarian psychology. The leader begins to interpret every setback as betrayal, every disagreement as treason, every alternative viewpoint as sabotage. And when that mindset takes hold, the regime starts to consume itself. It's already happening. You can see it in the mysterious deaths of businessmen, the purges of defense officials, the quiet firings of regional governors. You can see it in the sudden arrests of war bloggers who were once allowed to criticize the military. You can see it in the witch hunts inside state corporations. These are not the actions of a healthy regime. These are the tremors of an aging rule struggling to maintain coherence. And while this implosion unfolds at the elite level, a different kind of unraveling is happening among ordinary people, not through resistance, but through apathy, through detachment, through the slow, corrosive realization that nothing will get better. Russia is facing a demographic implosion. Young people are leaving or dying in a war they didn't choose. Birth rates are collapsing. Skilled workers are gone. Universities are struggling to retain staff. Research institutions are hollowing out. An entire generation is being drained away. This creates a psychological shift far more dangerous than protest, a shift toward fatalism. Russians don't rise when they lose fear. They rise when they regain hope. But when a population loses both fear and hope, what remains is withdrawal, quiet rebellion, a refusal to participate in the state's illusions. And that shows up everywhere. In the empty seats at propaganda rallies, in the quiet jokes whispered on the metro, in the sudden popularity of VPN tutorials, in the falling viewership of state TV, in the coded memes ridiculing official speeches, in the hushed conversations of parents worried their sons will be drafted. This slow withdrawal of belief is the beginning of the end for any authoritarian system, because regimes don't collapse when the opposition wins. They collapse when the population stops playing along. But Russia is not just dealing with internal decay. It's dealing with a world that has moved on, a world where the old tools of intimidation no longer work. Threats of gas cutoffs don't scare Europe. Threats of nuclear rhetoric don't unsettle NATO. Threats of partnership don't sway China. The global balance of power has shifted, not dramatically, but decisively. Russia's economy now accounts for less than 2% of global GDP. Its military, once feared, has been exposed as corrupt and poorly equipped. Its political influence is shrinking. Its allies are transactional. Its enemies are patient. And the longer the war drags on, the more Russia drains itself. Yet despite all this, the biggest danger is not collapse itself, it's what comes after. Because Russian history is filled with moments where the fall of one strongman simply paved the way for another. A cycle of repression, decay, disillusionment, and rebirth under a new authoritarian face. And that brings us to the central question: what breaks the cycle? So let's move forward. Because the moment we're entering now is where the script of power, not just Putin's script, but Russia's centuries-old script, starts repeating its most dangerous lines. And understanding this part matters, because it tells us not only where things are heading, but why they tend to end the same way every time. Not with revolution, not with liberation, but with vacuum. A vacuum of authority, of vision, of alternative. A vacuum that history in Russia has always filled with another strongman. And that's the tragedy at the heart of this story. Because Russia is not collapsing because Putin is weak. It's collapsing because he made the state depend entirely on his strength. A system that cannot function without one man is a system already on life support. Putin didn't just centralize power, he centralized identity. He welded the nation's sense of stability to his own persona. He told Russians, without me, there is chaos. Without me, there is humiliation. Without me, the world will crush you. That message worked for a while, until it didn't. Because when you bind a nation's fate to a single figure, you don't create unity. You create fragility. You create a system that cannot adapt, cannot reform, cannot correct itself. A system that becomes terrified of its own shadow. And that's where Russia is tonight. A country where the fear once used to control society has reversed direction. The fear now flows upward. Ministers fear displeasing the president. The president fears betrayal. Bureaucrats fear exposure. Generals fear accountability. Oligarchs fear confiscation. And everyone fears becoming the next scapegoat. Fear stops being glue. Fear becomes acid. But let's slow down. Because it's not enough to say the system is failing. We need to look at how it's failing. Because authoritarian collapse doesn't happen in straight lines. It comes in waves, quiet ones at first, then louder, then overwhelming. And Russia is currently in the middle of the second wave. The first wave was denial. Sanctions will fail. The West is weak. The ruble is strong. The economy has adapted. Simple slogans, simple illusions, all meant to convince the population that the storm had passed. The second wave, the one happening now, is disorientation, confusion, blame, purges, internal investigations, sudden firings, a constant search for enemies, a desperate attempt to understand why the machine is sputtering despite all the propaganda insisting it is fine. And the third wave, the one that always comes last, is collapse. Not necessarily dramatic, not necessarily violent, often slow, bureaucratic, anticlimactic, a process where the state loses the capacity to make decisions, where officials wait for instructions that never arrive, where the system becomes so tangled in its own fear that it stops functioning altogether. Russia has already dipped its feet into that third wave. Look at how decisions are made in Moscow now, not through strategy sessions, not through institutional planning, but through improvisation, legal improvisation, economic improvisation, military improvisation, a government that constantly reacts but never leads, a government that can escalate force but cannot solve problems, a government that cannot admit mistakes. So it repeats them, doubling down, layering lies upon lies, until even the people telling them stop remembering what the original truth looked like. This is late-stage authoritarian paralysis, and it is happening in real time. But here's the part that's often misunderstood. Authoritarian regimes do not collapse when the opposition becomes strong. They collapse when the state becomes incompetent, and Russia is drifting into incompetence at every level. Hospitals running out of medicine, schools cutting budgets, courts clogged with political cases, factories struggling to produce basic components, border regions exposed, military supply chains fractured, municipal governments unable to fill vacancies. This is not rebellion, this is erosion. And erosion is far deadlier because it is irreversible. But let's pause, because we need to talk about the people inside the system who recognize this erosion, most clearly the technocrats. Russia's mid-level experts, the economists, analysts, regional planners, energy specialists, logistics coordinators. These are the individuals who actually keep the country functioning day to day. And they see the numbers, they see the shortages, they see the inefficiencies, they see the contradictions, they see the dead ends, and they are leaving. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, quiet resignations, quiet emigration, quiet transfers to foreign subsidiaries, quiet applications for residency abroad, quiet relocations of families. This quiet leak of competence is far more dangerous than the headline-grabbing departures of oligarchs, because losing a billionaire is symbolic. Losing a civil engineer, a software architect, an energy analyst, that's structural. That's the kind of loss a state cannot easily replace. And as these people vanish, the quality of governance declines, policies become irrational, implementation becomes inconsistent, decisions become arbitrary, bureaucratic errors multiply, corruption intensifies because oversight weakens. And the decay accelerates. But the decay isn't only inside institutions. It's also inside the national identity. Russians are tired not of Western pressure, not of sanctions, not of propaganda, but of uncertainty. Exhaustion is replacing fear as the dominant emotion, and exhaustion is far more corrosive. Exhaustion makes people stop caring, stop engaging, stop believing, stop pretending. Authoritarianism can survive outrage. It cannot survive indifference. Because once people stop performing loyalty, the regime loses its ritual power. And ritual power is everything in a system built on symbolic obedience. That's why the Kremlin invests so heavily in ceremony parades, speeches, televised meetings, portraits, award ceremonies, choreographed patriotism. But the cameras capture a different story now. You can see it in the stiff smiles, in the empty eyes, in the forced applause, in the pauses that come half a beat too late. The ritual is still being performed, but the belief behind it is fading. And belief is the only thing that makes the ritual work. This brings us to the most dangerous phase. The phase where the regime realizes belief is slipping and responds not with reform, but with escalation. Crackdowns intensify, laws tighten, dissent is punished more swiftly, accusations become more absurd, trials become more theatrical. The state lashes out because it no longer knows how to govern except through fear. But as fear escalates, loyalty declines. As loyalty declines, paranoia grows. As paranoia grows, governance collapses. This is the spiral. This is the inflection point. This is the part of the story Russia is entering now. And the irony is brutal. The man who promised to end the chaos of the 1,990 seconds has recreated it inside the palace walls. Only this time, the chaos is happening behind closed doors, among the elite, among the bureaucrats, among the people who once believed the system was eternal. But nothing built on fear is eternal. Nothing built on silence is permanent. Nothing built on one man's myth can survive once that myth cracks. And the crack is already visible. So let's continue, because now we're reaching the point where the cracks inside the system begin interacting with something even more unstable, the war. Not the battles themselves, not the shifting front lines, but the political, economic, and psychological gravity the war exerts on the entire state. Because the truth the Kremlin can't say out loud is that this war is no longer a conflict, it's an ecosystem. A self-perpetuating machine that consumes money, people, institutions, and hopes. And like any machine built in desperation, it's starting to pull the country apart. At the beginning, the Kremlin believed it could control the war just like it controls everything else, through narrative, through spectacle, through confidence. It promised a quick victory. It promised minimal casualties. It promised economic resilience. But war has a way of stripping illusions bare. It demands resources. It demands logistics. It demands steady leadership, competent planning, sustainable financing, all things a personalized, hollowed-out authoritarian system cannot provide. And so the war mutated into something else, a drain that no longer stops at the battlefield. It reaches into banks, schools, hospitals, factories, and living rooms. It affects every price tag, every plane ticket, every family conversation. It has become the central gravitational force in Russian life, bending every institution around its needs. You can see this in the budget. More than 6% of Russia's GDP now goes to defense spending, the highest level since the Soviet era. But money spent on weapons is money not spent on hospitals. Money spent on shells is money not spent on teachers. Money spent on drones is money not spent on infrastructure. This isn't a policy choice. It's cannibalization. A starving system consuming its own future to survive the present. And here's the part that's even more dangerous. Once a state becomes dependent on war spending, peace becomes a financial threat. The war has become the engine that keeps the political class afloat. It gives contracts to oligarchs. It gives promotions to generals. It gives propaganda something to shout about. It gives the Kremlin a justification for repression. In a way, the state has trapped itself. Ending the war would require admitting failure. Ending the war would require rebuilding institutions that no longer exist. Ending the war would require giving people back the freedoms the government has spent years taking away. So the war drags on, not because it's winnable, not because it's strategic, but because ending it would collapse the illusion. And as the war stretches into years, the psychological toll grows heavier. Every coffin that returns to a provincial town chips away at the propaganda. Every missing soldier deepens distrust. Every mother who asks why her son died in a special military operation that still hasn't ended becomes a problem the state can't contain. These aren't dissidents. These aren't activists. These are ordinary Russians forced to confront the human cost of a war their government promised would never reach them. But the Kremlin can't acknowledge that suffering because to acknowledge it would be to admit weakness. So it tries to manage the problem the only way it knows how, with control. Official casualty numbers are hidden. Obituaries are censored. Mothers are pressured into silence. Regional officials are instructed to avoid public funerals. And yet the truth spreads anyway through telegram channels, through private chats, through whispers in small towns, where everyone knows everyone else's business. The state can hide statistics, but it cannot hide grief. Grief is the one truth authoritarianism has never been able to fully suppress. But let's step back, because the war's impact goes far beyond human loss. Its most profound effect is the way it has revealed the weakness of the Russian state, not militarily, but organizationally. The army Russia sent to Ukraine wasn't the modernized, agile force it claimed to be. It was a facade, a hollow institution stuffed with corruption, outdated equipment, and incompetent leadership. Years of siphoning funds, inflating reports, and promoting loyalists over experts created an army that looked powerful on paper and fell apart when tested. Dysfunction at the front reflects dysfunction in Moscow. And dysfunction in Moscow reflects dysfunction in the system, because the military is not separate from the government, it's a mirror. And what that mirror shows is a regime that has spent so long performing strength, it forgot how to build it. The war stripped off the costume. It exposed the rot. It showed Russians, elites, and ordinary people alike that the state they were taught to fear is nowhere near as competent as they believed. This realization is destabilizing not because it sparks rebellion, but because it sparks doubt. And doubt in authoritarian systems spreads like mold. It creeps into every institution. Generals doubt whether orders are based on reality or politics. Bureaucrats doubt whether they will be blamed for failures they didn't cause. Oligarchs doubt whether their wealth is secure. Regional officials doubt whether Moscow can protect them. Ordinary citizens doubt whether the future will ever improve. And when a population doubts the future, it stops investing in it. People don't save. They don't plan. They don't innovate. They don't take risks. They simply endure. And endurance is not stability. Endurance is a slow suffocation of national potential. Let's pause here, because this brings us to one of the most important shifts happening inside Russia, the redistribution of power away from institutions and toward informal networks. When formal structures weaken, informal ones take over. Mercenary groups grow in influence. Businessmen with private armies become power brokers. Criminal networks fill economic gaps. Regional leaders form quiet alliances. This erosion of centralized control doesn't lead to democracy. It leads to fragmentation. And fragmentation is the nightmare scenario for any authoritarian leader. Because fragmentation means power no longer flows smoothly from the top. Orders no longer spread with the same force. Loyalty becomes conditional. Corruption becomes decentralized. Chaos becomes more likely. And when chaos becomes more likely, regimes don't reform. They panic. They crack down harder. They grasp tighter. They lash out at real and imagined enemies. They purify their ranks. They purge their ministries. They blame saboteurs, traitors, foreign agents. This is exactly what's unfolding now. The system is shrinking inward. It is isolating itself. It is growing more brittle. And brittle systems do not break gradually, they break suddenly. But the most dangerous part is this. The war, which was supposed to strengthen Putin's grip, has become the force accelerating his decline. It is the pressure that reveals every weakness, the weight that exposes every lie, the catalyst that speeds up every crack in the foundation. And in the end, the war may not be the cause of the collapse, merely the spotlight that illuminated what was always there, a regime built on illusions, now running out of places to hide. All right, that's the next to 1,000 words. So let's keep going, because now we're entering the phase of the story that rarely gets talked about, not the political collapse, not the military failures, not the economic strain, but the psychological break between the ruler and the ruled. This is the moment in every authoritarian era when the distance between the leader's narrative and the people's lived reality becomes too wide to bridge, too obvious to ignore, too painful to pretend away. And that distance doesn't appear suddenly, it creeps in quietly, almost invisibly, until one day the performance stops working. And that's exactly what's happening inside Russia tonight. Because for 20 years, Putin's power relied on one fundamental principle, the idea that he, and only he, could protect Russians from instability. Not prosperity, not justice, not fairness, but order. He sold the memory of the 1,990 seconds as a warning. He said, remember the chaos? Remember the poverty? Remember the humiliation? That won't happen again as long as I'm here. It was a simple story, and simple stories are powerful. Fear is powerful. Nostalgia is powerful. But fear and nostalgia are not renewable resources. They run out. And the moment people start experiencing real instability, economic instability, international instability, personal instability, the myth collapses. Because the one thing authoritarian regimes cannot survive is self-contradiction. The moment reality contradicts the myth dies. And when the myth dies, the leader's legitimacy collapses with it. For years, Russians tolerated corruption, censorship, inequality, stagnation, because the system felt stable, predictable, familiar. But that stability is gone. And once stability disappears, fear becomes less persuasive. People start to see through it. They start to question it. They start to resent it. And resentment is the most dangerous emotion a population can feel toward its ruler. Not rage. Rage burns fast. Not outrage. Outrage can be distracted. But resentment simmers. It accumulates. It festers. It dissolves the emotional contract between the state and the people. And once that contract dissolves, rebuilding it becomes nearly impossible. You can see this resentment everywhere, even without protests. In the weariness in people's faces, in the quiet sarcasm online, in the cynical jokes about officials, in the way Russians talk about the government instead of our government, in the resignation parents feel when their sons receive draft notices, in the way young people no longer see a future inside their own country. This psychological shift is more important than any battlefield loss, any economic sanction, any diplomatic isolation, because authoritarian power is psychological before it is political. It relies on belief, belief in inevitability, belief in strength, belief in control. The moment that belief cracks, the architecture of fear begins to collapse, and that crack is widening. But let's slow down, because we need to talk about the other side of this psychological chasm, the isolation of the ruler himself. Because one of the defining features of late-stage autocracy is the growing distance between the leader and the population. Not just physical distance, not just emotional distance, but informational distance. Authoritarians stop receiving real information. Their inner circles shrink. Their advisors filter bad news. Their ministers lie to avoid punishment. Their generals exaggerate successes and hide failures. Their bureaucrats bend numbers to satisfy expectations. And the leader becomes trapped in a feedback loop of delusion. This is not unique to Putin. It happened to the czars. It happened to Soviet general secretaries. But the modern version is even more severe because the Kremlin is now a palace of curated realities. Every meeting Putin attends is staged, every applause line rehearsed, every public appearance choreographed. He is surrounded not by a government, but by an audience. And when a leader governs from within a theater, he begins to mistake the applause for reality. This disconnect is why late-stage authoritarian decisions become increasingly irrational. The leader is no longer making choices based on conditions. He is making choices based on illusions. He governs a country that exists only in the documents he is shown, the reports he is handed, the briefings he receives, all filtered, all sanitized, all optimized to avoid angering him. And that leads to catastrophic miscalculations. It leads to believing the war would end in 3 days. It leads to believing the West would not unite. It leads to believing the economy could endure isolation. It leads to believing loyalty is unbreakable. And when these illusions collide with reality, when the leader is forced to confront the consequences of his own decisions, the instinct is not reform. It is escalation. Because admitting failure is more dangerous than continuing it. But escalation cannot fix systemic decay. It only accelerates it. This is why the Kremlin's grip feels tighter and weaker at the same time. More arrests, more censorship, more propaganda, and yet more cracks, more mistakes, more contradictions, a government that talks louder because its voice carries less weight, a leadership that appears omnipresent because it's afraid of disappearing. And this is where another critical shift emerges, the shift from fear-based governance to suspicion-based governance. Fear controls the public, suspicion controls the elite. And suspicion is far more lethal to the internal integrity of a regime. Elites stop trusting one another. Ministers stop sharing information. Governors stop volunteering problems. Businessmen stop investing. Generals stop reporting losses. The system becomes opaque even to itself. And when a government cannot see its own weaknesses, it cannot correct them. This self-inflicted blindness is what destroyed the Soviet system. It is what destroyed every authoritarian system before it. And it is what is eating the Kremlin from the inside right now. But let's pause, because the most profound psychological shift isn't happening among the elite or even among ordinary citizens. It's happening among young Russians, a generation raised in the digital world, a generation that is less afraid, less indoctrinated, less willing to accept the idea that Russia must forever choose between authoritarian stability and democratic chaos. This generation is leaving in record numbers, and those who stay are disconnecting emotionally from the state. They see the propaganda, they hear the rhetoric, they watch the speeches, and they do not believe a word of it. That disbelief is a time bomb, not because it will explode violently, but because it erodes the foundation of authoritarian inheritance. Young people are no longer stepping into the roles the system needs them to fill. They are rejecting the premise of the system entirely. And that is something the Kremlin cannot suppress, cannot arrest, cannot censor. You cannot imprison an entire generation's imagination. You cannot force a belief into people who do not see a future under your rule. This, perhaps more than anything else, is the quiet beginning of the end. Not rebellion, not protest, not revolution, but generational detachment, a population that looks at its ruler and feels nothing. No loyalty, no fear, no inspiration, no respect. Just distance. And distance is fatal to authoritarianism. So let's keep moving, because now we're entering the point where the internal and external pressures on Russia begin to merge into something more volatile. Not simply political instability, not simply economic deterioration, but a full-spectrum erosion of state capacity. This is the stage where all the quiet failures, all the hidden cracks, all the whispered doubts begin subtly coordinating with one another, forming a pressure the system can no longer distribute evenly. This is not collapse. This is pre-collapse. And pre-collapse is always the most deceptive phase, because on the surface, everything still looks functional. The government still holds meetings. The president still gives speeches. The generals still salute. The television anchors still smile. The flags still wave over Red Square. But underneath that layer of choreography, something essential is breaking. The ability of the state to perform its basic functions. Not spectacular functions, not grand geopolitical ones, just basic ones. And once a state begins failing at its basics, the collapse becomes a matter of trajectory, not possibility. You can already see this in the way Russia's regions are quietly slipping out of Moscow's grip, not through rebellion, not through protest, but through necessity. Regional governors are being forced to make decisions the federal center can no longer coordinate. Local import strategies, food supply arrangements, energy management, emergency logistics, even informal negotiations with neighboring countries for spare parts or fuel. Moscow still pretends it controls everything, but the distance between control and appearance has grown too wide. This is how empires fragment, not because the center falls first, but because the edges begin improvising. And improvisation is dangerous in a country built on rigid hierarchy, because when regions improvise, they do so according to their own interests. Some start aligning more with China, some lean toward Kazakhstan. Some maintain quiet economic relationships with Europe despite sanctions. Others simply try to isolate themselves from Moscow's demands. The federal system begins to act like a loose collection of fiefdoms rather than a unified state. And the Kremlin knows this, which is why it has reacted not with empowerment, but with pressure. Governors are threatened, local officials are purged, loyalty tests are administered. And every time the center tightens its grip, the regions learn the same lesson. Moscow cannot help them, only punish them. That is how the political contract breaks. But let's slow down, because this fragmentation isn't just geographical, it's institutional. Entire ministries are beginning to operate in silos, no longer sharing information, no longer coordinating with one another, no longer trusting one another. The Ministry of Finance hides bad numbers from the Ministry of Economy. The Ministry of Defense hides failures from the President. The Ministry of Health hides shortages from regional hospitals. Everyone hides everything from everyone else. Hiding is the default behavior of a collapsing authoritarian system. Because when fear replaces competence, every institution becomes its own bunker. This leads to the next quiet disaster, the collapse of bureaucratic coherence. Civil servants no longer take initiative. Mid-level managers avoid decisions. Local administrators delay paperwork. Nobody wants responsibility. Nobody wants visibility. Nobody wants to be the one who signs the wrong document. Russia's administrative machine, once slow but stable, is becoming paralyzed by risk aversion. Tasks pile up, projects stall, decisions are postponed indefinitely. A country of 140 million people begins to drift without internal coordination, as if the lights are still on, but nobody knows who controls the switches. And while the machine slows, corruption accelerates. Because when institutions weaken, corruption steps into the vacancy. Officials no longer fear being caught. The system is too distracted. Contractors inflate prices openly. Customs officers demand higher bribes. Military procurement turns into a feeding frenzy. Every crisis becomes an opportunity for profit. Corruption stops being a side effect. It becomes the dominant operating system. And a country where corruption becomes the operating system is a country that cannot execute long-term policy. It can only react in fragments. But let's talk about something even more destabilizing: the collapse of professional culture. Russia still has excellent scientists, engineers, doctors, programmers. But many of them have left. Those who remain face shortages of equipment, restrictions on international collaboration, lack of funding, and political interference. Entire research institutes have lost half their staff. Universities are becoming isolated islands. Hospitals are losing specialists to emigration or the war. Infrastructure projects are delayed due to lack of expertise. This is not a temporary disruption. This is structural decline. A state can survive losing money. It cannot survive losing competence. Because money can be replaced, expertise cannot. Russia is becoming a country that can no longer maintain the complexity of a modern economy. Planes, power grids, telecommunications, rail systems, medical supply chains. These require specialized knowledge, global integration, and long-term planning, all of which are eroding. And when modern complexity decays, it doesn't decay slowly. It decays all at once. Let's pause here, because the most telling indicator of a failing state is not economic contraction or military defeat. It's the collapse of institutional narrative. A functioning government can explain itself, it can articulate priorities, it can define goals, it can justify policies. A failing government cannot. And you can hear this in Russia's propaganda now. Early propaganda was confident, narrative-driven, coherent. It spoke in complete thoughts. It had rhythm, structure, intent. Today's propaganda is fragmented, contradictory, chaotic. One day the war is existential. The next day it's routine. One day the West is collapsing. The next day Russia needs more Western imports. One day victory is inevitable. The next day compromise is strategic. Propaganda loses its power not when people reject it, but when the state stops believing it itself. And that's where we are now. The Kremlin no longer seems to know what story it's telling. The messaging changes weekly, almost daily. The tone shifts from triumphal to defensive to confused. The slogans feel stale. The speeches feel repetitive. The anchor smiles feel forced. And the audience, even the loyal audience, has started to tune it out. Because propaganda can hypnotize only if it offers a stable fantasy. When the fantasy becomes unstable, propaganda becomes noise. This noise feeds back into the political system, fueling deeper confusion, deeper distrust, deeper fragmentation. The state loses not just its capacity to govern, but its capacity to imagine a future. And a government that cannot imagine the future eventually loses control of the present. So let's continue, because now we're stepping into the part of the story where Russia's internal collapse begins to reshape its foreign relationships in ways that go far beyond diplomacy. This isn't simply about sanctions or alliances anymore. It's about a deeper geopolitical repositioning, a slow but unmistakable shift in how the world sees Russia, how it interacts with Russia, and ultimately how it plans for a future where Russia is no longer a predictable actor, but a destabilized, shrinking power. Because for decades, global politics revolved around one assumption: that Russia, no matter how corrupt or autocratic, was at least stable, that it had a functioning state apparatus, that it could manage its own institutions, that it could enforce its own borders, that its leadership, however aggressive, was rational, that its economy, while dependent on natural resources, was functional enough to maintain national cohesion. That assumption is gone now. Nobody says it aloud, not in Beijing, not in Berlin, not in Washington, but the world is quietly preparing for a future where Russia is not only weaker, but potentially ungovernable. And you can see this preparation everywhere if you know where to look. China, for example, is increasing its presence in Central Asia at a pace that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. Deals with Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan are being signed without Moscow's participation. Infrastructure projects that once required Russian approval are now bypassing it entirely. Chinese diplomats speak openly about regional stabilization, a phrase that in diplomatic language is a polite way of saying, we expect turbulence, and we're preparing to manage it without you. Even India, long committed to its doctrine of non-alignment, is diversifying its military imports, slowly reducing its dependence on Russian weapons. Indian strategists privately talk about a post-Russia era in Asia, where Moscow's role in balancing China weakens significantly. When a country like India quietly adjusts its long-term calculations, it signals more than doubt. It signals anticipation. And Europe? Europe has made a once-in-a-century strategic shift. It has reorganized its entire energy infrastructure, rewritten its defense priorities, expanded NATO, rebuilt industrial capacity, and begun channeling billions into technological resilience, all because of the realization that Russia is no longer a reliable part of the global system. European leaders don't just see Russia as a threat, they see it as a failing state. And failing states produce different kinds of risks: spillover conflict, refugee waves, nuclear uncertainty, cross-border instability, and economic unpredictability. This is the quiet fear spreading through diplomatic circles, not the fear of a strong Russia, but the fear of a collapsing one. But let's slow down, because the more profound shift isn't happening between Russia and the West. It's happening in the global South regions, where Russia invested heavily in influence campaigns, energy deals, military cooperation, and political partnerships. Take Africa. For years, Russia's Wagner mercenaries acted as both a shadow army and a geopolitical bargaining chip. They propped up governments, secured mining contracts, spread propaganda, and projected Russian presence without official armies. But with Wagner fractured, with funding uncertain, with Moscow preoccupied, many of these governments are quietly diversifying their alliances. Some are turning to China, some to Turkey, some to the UAE. Russia is no longer seen as a stable patron. In the Middle East, where Russia once leveraged its role in Syria to assert influence, the tone has shifted. Saudi Arabia and the UAE now negotiate with Moscow from a position of confidence, not deference. Iran, once Russia's junior partner, is increasingly treating Russia as a dependent customer rather than a strategic equal. Every negotiation, every military transaction, every diplomatic statement carries the subtle undertone of a relationship that has lost its balance. And here's the part that's even more significant. Global energy markets, which once bent around Russia's production, have adapted. New supply chains, new LNG terminals, new pricing structures. Russia's ability to coerce or pressure through energy has evaporated. Oil producers adjust without it. Gas distributors adjust without it. The world has discovered that it doesn't need Russia nearly as much as Moscow believed. This is the geopolitical cliff Russia now stands on. Not isolation, but irrelevance. But let's pivot. Because while the world adjusts to Russia's decline externally, inside Russia, another process is unfolding: the rewriting of the state's myth. Every collapsing regime attempts to control its legacy. Every authoritarian leader tries to shape the narrative of his downfall, and Putin is no exception. You can already see the outlines of this narrative forming. The West betrayed us. Saboteurs undermined us. The elites were disloyal. The people were ungrateful. The world was unfair. History will vindicate us. This is not propaganda for the public. This is propaganda for the inner circle, a narrative designed to keep the elite paralyzed, disoriented, self-blaming. Because if they begin to see the cracks clearly, they might begin to imagine alternatives. And alternatives are dangerous for any authoritarian ruler. But this myth is failing too, because myths require belief, and belief requires performance, and performance requires energy. And Russians, elites, and citizens alike are running out of the emotional energy required to pretend. You can feel this exhaustion even in the Kremlin's own messaging. Speeches that once felt confident now feel strained. Announcements that once projected authority now project insecurity. The state is talking more, but saying less. Threatening more, but achieving less. Appearing everywhere, but convincing no one. This is what political scientists call the hollowing out phase of authoritarianism, when the state remains visible but loses substance, when institutions exist but stop functioning, when propaganda flows but fails to persuade, when loyalty is still performed but no longer believed, when the system looks intact from a distance but up close reveals the texture of decay. This phase is dangerous not because it guarantees collapse, but because it guarantees unpredictability. A stable authoritarian system is predictable. An eroding one is erratic. It makes impulsive decisions. It reacts emotionally. It blames external forces for internal failures. It escalates when it should negotiate. It isolates when it should integrate. It punishes when it should reform. And Russia is entering exactly that phase. But here's the final piece of this puzzle: the moment where internal erosion meets international recalibration. The realization, growing quietly in capitals around the world, that Russia may be heading toward an era not of disappearance, but of fragmentation. A Russia that is weaker, poorer, angrier, more unstable. A Russia with fewer resources and more internal divides. A Russia where regional identities grow stronger as federal authority weakens. A Russia where the military struggles to maintain cohesion. A Russia where political elites fracture into rival factions. A Russia where the central myth, the myth of unity, breaks. This is the scenario the world is preparing for. Not the fall of Russia, but the breaking of it. And as that possibility grows closer, the question becomes not whether the world can handle a collapsing Russia, but whether Russia can handle itself. So let's continue. Because now we're stepping into the part of the story where the long arc of Russian history starts bending toward its familiar conclusion, not through a dramatic overthrow, not through a foreign invasion, but through internal exhaustion, through the slow suffocation of a system that can no longer sustain its own weight, through the quiet unraveling of a political myth that has lasted longer than anyone expected. And this is the moment where everything becomes both more fragile and more dangerous. Because when authoritarian systems reach this stage, when belief collapses, when institutions hollow out, when elites fragment, when the leader isolates, when the war becomes unwinnable, when the economy cannibalizes itself, when the public withdraws, the regime doesn't simply break. It spirals, it thrashes, it searches for an exit that no longer exists. And in that thrashing, it makes choices that accelerate the end rather than delaying it. That's what we're seeing now. Not a confident government, not a stable state, but a system desperately trying to outrun consequences it spent 2 decades pretending didn't exist. You can feel this desperation in Putin's recent speeches that no longer sound like declarations of strength, but like justifications, appeals, explanations. A man talking to history, trying to shape how he will be remembered. A leader who once spoke as if he controlled events, now speaks as if he is reacting to them. That is the most telling shift. Autocrats stop sounding like autocrats when they lose control of the narrative. But let's slow down, because we need to examine the most important transformation happening right now, not at the top, not among the elites, but at the emotional core of the nation. Russians are experiencing something they've experienced before at key moments in history, the sense that the state no longer represents a path forward, but a weight dragging the country down. This isn't rebellion. This isn't revolution. This is disillusionment. And disillusionment is the quiet force that breaks empires. You can see it in the way people talk about the future, or rather, in the way they no longer talk about it. The future used to be a topic in Russia, a point of pride, a source of aspiration, a direction. But now, discussions about the future feel suspended, deferred, muted. Young people don't plan careers, they plan exits. Families don't plan for prosperity, they plan for survival. Scientists don't plan research, they plan for visas. Soldiers don't plan victory, they plan escape. A nation that stops believing in its own future is a nation entering collapse. But collapse, in Russia's case, won't look like a single moment. It won't look like the Berlin Wall. It won't look like Maidan. It won't look like fireworks or flames or cheering crowds. It will look like what it looked like before. In 1917, in 1991, a slow, grinding, bureaucratic implosion. A decay that becomes impossible to hide, even for those working inside it. And that's where we need to turn next. The psychology of the people inside the Kremlin, the ones who keep the system running. Because as the system weakens, they face a terrible dilemma, one so dangerous, so emotionally corrosive, that it shapes the final stage of every authoritarian collapse. Do they stay loyal? Or do they survive? For 20 years, loyalty was easy. The system rewarded it, protected it, enriched it. But now loyalty comes with risk. Loyalty means inheriting blame. Loyalty means sharing responsibility for failures that were never yours. Loyalty means being tied to a sinking structure. And for many, that's a cost they can no longer bear. You can see this calculation playing out in small ways. Officials suddenly taking more sick days, generals avoiding public appearances, businessmen traveling more frequently, bureaucrats delaying decisions, ministers quietly moving their families abroad, diplomats sending resumes to think tanks. These aren't dramatic acts of defection. They are soft exits, quiet exits, the exits that signal the system's emotional cohesion is breaking. And once emotional cohesion breaks, institutional cohesion follows. But let's pause here, because there is a deeper insight we need to confront, one that transcends politics. Authoritarian systems don't die when the population revolts. They die when the population mentally leaves. When people stop believing, when they stop participating, when they stop internalizing the rituals, when they stop fearing the consequences, when they stop investing in the narrative, and Russians are mentally leaving, not all at once, not with slogans, not with marches, but with silence, a silence that feels different from the silence that held the system together. The old silence was obedience. The new silence is absence, a withdrawal of belief, of attention, of effort. A quiet refusal to continue playing a role in a performance that no longer feels convincing. This kind of silence is fatal, because authoritarianism is a theater, and theater requires an audience. Without emotional engagement, the performance collapses. The actors lose their cues. The script loses its meaning. The applause never comes. And that's what's happening now in Russia. The applause is disappearing. Which brings us to the final point, the one that will shape not only Russia's fate, but the world's response to it. What comes after? A collapsing authoritarian regime rarely transitions into democracy. It rarely produces stability. It rarely generates unity. Instead, it produces uncertainty, and in Russia's case, that uncertainty carries nuclear weapons, vast territory, deep ethnic divides, competing elites, and a legacy of unresolved trauma. This is the danger nobody wants to say out loud, the danger of what Russia becomes when the current system finally loses its last pillar. The danger is not that Putin remains in power forever. The danger is what fills the vacuum when he no longer can. Will a new strongman emerge harder, younger, even more nationalistic? Will the elite fracture into competing factions? Will regions push for greater autonomy? Will the military assert itself politically? Will chaos invite foreign influence? Will economic collapse trigger social unrest? Will the system simply drift into stagnation and decay? These are the questions intelligence agencies are studying. These are the scenarios diplomats are quietly preparing for. These are the outcomes economists model behind closed doors. Because the world has learned something it didn't want to learn. A collapsing Russia may be more dangerous than a rising Russia. But here's the unexpected twist, the one sliver of possibility in the middle of this darkness. Collapse is not destiny. Cycles can break, systems can evolve, nations can transform. Russia is a country with extraordinary cultural depth, intellectual brilliance, and human resilience. It is not doomed to forever repeat its past. It is not condemned to authoritarianism. Its people are not defined by their rulers. And maybe, just maybe, the collapse of this particular system, hollow and brittle as it is, creates the conditions for something better. Not immediately, not cleanly, not perfectly, but eventually. A generation already exists inside Russia that rejects the old myth, rejects the strongman, rejects the false stability of fear. If the system falls, it will not be because that generation rose up, but because it refused to kneel down. And when an entire generation stops kneeling, history shifts.